Hello, welcome back to the Fractional Typology Project. My name is Titi Koshi, and today I'm going to be talking about Coraline. Just a little information about my channel. I do personality analysis, and so far the only video I've made is for One Piece. This is my first time doing a movie. This is a lot. I might have to split this up into multiple videos. You'll know better than I at this point. So, let's get into it. First of all, two disclaimers. One, I'm going to spoil all of Coraline. If you haven't seen it, make sure to before watching, but it's a pretty infamous classic movie, so I would be surprised. Two, this video is not for kids. I'm going to talk about the adult subject matter that this movie hints at. Please only watch if you are 18 plus. The movie starts with a doll flying into a cobweb-covered window, which is caught by the beldam. The doll is of Miss Lovat's sister, taken 60 years ago. Like, taken from this world. Not, well, she did die, but the webs do not seem to belong to the beldam. Okay, there are cobwebs all over that intro sequence. I don't think they're the beldam's webs. She brushes them aside irrelevantly while she does her work. I doubt she even feeds on bugs, eating the beetle to gross Coraline out during the Cocoa Beetle scene. So as you can see, I'm already spoiling elements of the movie. The logistics of space, time, and their relation to dreams is kept ambiguous. None of it is logical and logistical in my view. No sufficient evidence for a coherent theory of movement. So how the doll moves into this window of wherever, could be real world, could be the other world, how it moves out and just flies out, don't know. How it then ends up in Miss Lovat's possession, to which she then puts it in her trunk, in my view hides it, we just don't know. Same way that we don't know how the cat moves around. It's magic. No idea how the doll flies in and flies out and ends up in the trunk other than magic. I suspect this intro doll scene is presented out of chronological order after Coraline has arrived, but is presented first for its thematic and tonal value. I don't think the other mother has any way of tracking or stalking Coraline prior to her move to the Pink Palace Apartments. I think this was just presented out of order, for the reasons that it's very, like, resonant to the predation and doll type thing that is core to the movie. The beldam is almost made of thin metal needles with cracked porcelain skin. This emphasizes what a needle is: precise, pointed, creative towards its own ends. I'll use the term instrumental predator to describe the beldam in these notes. The story of the apartment's tenants is sad. Mr. Bobinski wants to be amazing, but his plans for a mice circus have yet to work out. Miss Spink and Miss Forcible used to be hits, but are now forgotten. The apartments are neglected, in the sense that they have, old windows, old heating systems, old water systems with grungy water and, silverfish crawling across the bathtub. So too are the tenants. All of the tenants are under-recognized and underpaid, including Mel and Charlie Jones, including Mr. Bobinski, including Miss Spink and Miss Forcible. And they're also neglected emotionally. It's like they want to be certain things, but those things have not come to fruition yet, especially for Bobinski and Spink and Forcible. It reminds me of Disco Elysium, the lived experience of beginning to fail, to fall. It's naturally sad and real. Almost all of the characters participate in some kind of creative profession. It's interesting how much that's a sort of thematic consistency between the characters. Wybe's the only exception. Um, Both her parents are in the publishing industry for the garden catalog, for Garden Life. Mr. Bobinski is, a performer, and, Spink and Forcible are from the theater. It's all creative, and it's also underpaid, and that's the reason they're in a neglected apartment. So, the sadness is emphasized by the boy who drops his ice cream in the painting. So, this is one of the core contrasts between the real world and the other world. And it's interesting because the other world is made up, so of course everything's happy and positive. But what makes the real world sad? And I think it's this sort of it's a more genuine thing of disappointment and compromise, which I talk about in these, which also reminds me of Disco Elysium. What does it mean to live in a fallen state? What does it mean to live in, a place where the Soviet Union failed, where communism failed, and that's a Disco Elysium thing. But you know, a lot of the tragedy of Coraline is actually just getting old. It's like Bobinski is no longer in his prime. And Bobinski also has a storied past that we don't get to know about. I'll mention later that he has like a Chernobyl liquidator medal. It's like what's that? And what part of his history, what part of his life was that a part of? Spink and Forcible were in a lot of productions that have high value posters. It's like when was that period in their life, and how did things progress to here? The concept of getting old and death is also represented in the taxidermied dogs that Spink keeps and values. Um, the apartment itself is old, with old infrastructure that hasn't been updated. There's something to that. There's something to the neglect of that, and that's a lot of what I talk about here. The movers do not care for Mr. Bobinski's impressive acrobatics, nor does Mr. Bobinski care for the labor of the movers. Mel honks at Bobinski in distaste. Bobinski responds in kind. Both are neglected in their needs, both lashing out from personal perspectives. Mel is like, you shouldn't do that. And I don't think that Mel is really paying attention to where Bobinski is coming from when he's doing the things that he's doing. And then Bobinski isn't paying attention to where Mel is coming from. It's just like, oh, you're rude. And it doesn't, they're not connecting, Just like how Mel is like, oh no, Bobinski is drunk. Oh, the Spink and Forcible are dingbats. It's like she's not connecting to what is alive in them. And I think that neglect of their needs is a thing that's very central to Coraline's experience, but it's a thing that's central to a lot of people's experience living in um, adult American society. Like, it's a bit of a lonely um, state of things, and um, Coraline struggles with this, but everybody I think in this movie struggles to understand each other, and I think that's very true to life in a way that it's just true. So, but it's also sad and neglected, which is the betting that the other mother then comes to take advantage of. The Joneses are struggling financially. They only tip the movers $1. Mel struggles to budget for the gloves Coraline wants and seems genuinely sad that she's unhappy because they are publishers of a garden catalog, and their only burst of money is when that actually succeeds. The cat, on first sight, may recognize Coraline as the other mother's next victim. He may have convinced Wybe to stalk her early. Stalk. Because that was sort of established at the end of the film that, the cat was the one that convinced Wybe to follow Coraline. Which is a thing that makes Wybe a little more sympathetic in terms of the stalking behavior. Um, it's interesting that way. But that also contributes to how the film makes its characters a bit more sympathetic at the end of the film, which is a thing that I'll talk about when we get there, which, it's a lot of index cards before we get there. Um, Coraline is immediately looking for magic and adventure. She fashions a dowsing rod to find something magical. Now I don't know how true that is. I don't know if she was looking for anything or if she was always looking for a well. Because she seems like she denies the idea that she's looking for a well with Wybie, and I'm just not sure what her real answer is that way. Um, Coraline likes nature. She has a dragonfly hairpin, a praying mantis picture stand. She loves her raincoat, is comfortable with mud and gardening, and seems to love almost all animals except the silverfish in her bathtub. And I refine kind of what the distinction is in terms of what she does and doesn't love a bit later into these note cards. But I want to say this thing because I don't think I wrote it down, but just to say it. I think that dragonflies in this movie are given a bad rep. I think that there was a cultural entomology blog post about insects and what they mean culturally by an entomologist that was very engaged by what Coraline included in terms of bugs and what that meant on a cultural level, how that was sort of pioneering for cultural entomology. And he wrote a little tidbit of folklore that he thought was interesting that, dragonflies in some European folk tales were, the devil's sewing needles. They would sew people's eyes shut. And I think a lot of fan interpretations grabbed onto this for dragonflies as a hidden sort of negative thing that, maybe that was an early sign of the other mother stalking Coraline or stuff like that. And I just want to give my personal interpretation that I think that Coraline just likes dragonflies. That I think that it's not like that because dragonflies are never represented in a way that's negative in the film. Like there's a dragonfly hairpin, which is personal enough and sentimental enough that it's literally in her hair all the time, and then she hangs dragonflies up on her bed, and I will say, I think the cultural entomologist sandwiched that in his original blog post. He's like, "Oh, dragonflies are a benevolent part of, human companions." But also there's this folklore thing, but actually dragonflies, they're good and blah blah blah. And the negative thing is sandwiched between two positive paragraphs, but I think the catchiness of the inclusion of that folklore in the general um, predatory tone of Coraline, it struck a chord, and then it got spread. Um, and I think it's not true to how dragonflies are actually treated in the movie. Um, the other thing is, the dragonfly ornaments that hang on her bed are then, like real dragonflies that fly around her room in the other world, and it's like they talk a little bit and they're like, no, Coraline, stay, or whatever, before she like traps them in a toy box. So they're always a positive force. Like even the at least the praying mantis mobile comes back and is sort of a malicious force, which we'll get to. The symbolism of that or what exactly that means, but nothing bad happens with the dragonflies. They never do anything malicious and never do anything needle related. I think that dragonflies in this movie are purely benevolent, and I think that it's a misinterpretation to take that element of folklore and then tie it so strongly to the actions of the other mother. So, just I didn't write that down because I didn't think it was entirely worth writing down, but just well, it's on my brain. Um, the cat nods early on, but Coraline doesn't seem to notice. It's when it's like, oh, do you know the well? And then the cat nods, and it's like, oh, you're not responding, are you? So Coraline doesn't recognize that the cat responded, and that's just a thing she notices later when the cat starts to legit speak. She seems to be using the dowsing rod to find the well. However, this might be pretend. If I'm a water witch, then where's the well? Um, did she not want to find one? So I just found that confusing. Um, Sometimes I wonder if there's more than one index card here. Despite its first, Despite the first impressions of his motorbike, skeleton gloves, and skull mask, YB is not intimidating. Wybie seems nerdy and anxious, as well as unconscientious and generally unaware of his own body. He hunches, talks with his hands, and seems compelled to speak and give correct context, even if it's not socially appropriate or advantageous. He's not really my cat, he corrects Coraline, immediately giving context. He seems to enjoy the morbid to some novel degree, like how the cat will bring him little dead things. The cat also seems to appreciate Wybie. I wonder if he's protective of him, like if the cat is protective of Wybie. The cat reminds me of the Cheshire Cat. He can also teleport. I wonder how old he is. I sort of get the impression that the cat is some sort of mythical being that has been around for a long time, as long as the other mother has been preying on children. But I could be wrong. I don't know, but the cat is magic, though. So them being older would not surprise me. Wybie seems to appreciate tools and technology. His bike, the vision enhancements of his mask, his tongs, and camera. In his thoughts and attempts to understand people and the world, he neglects the emotional part of where Coraline is, not out of malice, just unawareness. When Coraline gets mad at him for scaring/stalking her, he doesn't respond to her emotional state, just giving more nerdy context. And in the scene where they first meet, he kind of talks. They talk past each other. It reminds me of the concept of the socionics ILE, which is the socionics ENTP. Ego NETI, figuring out the world. Vulnerable socio FI, not understanding how to manage relationships with others. So ignoring, interpersonal social context in order to, continue to yap about what you think about the world. This strikes at Coraline, however, because one of her main grievances is not feeling listened to or understood. And Wybie, due to his social obliviousness, can be as bad as her parents, which she says in the later scene, the banana slug scene. Coraline is brave, willing to say what she believes, and willing to fight. I suspect that Wybie and his grandma developed off of each other. His grandma, due to losing her sister, is deeply concerned for Wybie's safety, paranoid to keep him close. Pretty much any time that Wybie leaves, his Miss Lobat, rings the bell and is like, Wyborn, come back. And I think that stems from her fear of losing him, because she's very conscious and deliberate about the danger of the Pink Palace apartments. Meanwhile, Wybie tries not to upset her while approaching the world in a reasonable scientific way that keeps him safe. He most likely feels his grandma's beliefs are overkill and unnecessary. And I partly say that because when Coraline is sort of being very explicit about the dangers of the Pink Palace apartment, he's like, have you and my grandma been talking? Which makes me think that she's been pretty explicit about all of the elements of the ways in which the other mother can be malicious. And I also, understand that because he doesn't understand the supernatural danger of the apartments, maybe his want for good context is a want to understand the truth and live close to it, not an anxiety. He tries to figure out what to take seriously. So his grandma has sort of given him this fear of don't do this, don't go out, don't blah, blah, blah. And he's trying to figure out okay, what should I be afraid of and why? And so, I wonder if on some level, and I don't know how much the creators thought about that or whatever, but that could contribute to his inquisitiveness, is a reaction to that kind of fear. Because he has a very scientific approach. Wybie is very much about trying to figure out things truthfully. Is very, doubtful and skeptical, focused on the facts, in an attempt to be scientific. It's like, oh, it's not exactly scientific, but studies show that, or I heard, no, he didn't say studies show, but he said that thing about Carolyn and the idea of having normal expectations of people based on their name, which really struck at Coraline, and then that's an example of that sort of social obliviousness where he didn't recognize that that was an area that Coraline felt about at all, because I don't think he's focused on other people's feelings. It's interesting. I think Coraline loves nature, but she doesn't love gross things. She wipes the mud off of her hand from YB. She hates the silverfish in her bathtub. She's okay with the mud because she wants things growing at the apartment. It's like she wants the beautiful and nice aspects of nature. And there's something very nice about, praying mantises and silverfish. No, praying mantises and dragonflies. There's something not very nice about silverfish that crawl in your wall and stuff. Not being able to grow things is another sad compromise, where no one gets what they truly want. The combination produces sadness. It's symbolic that most neighbors, YB, Mr. Bobinski, and Spank Enforceable, call her Carolyn, or Caroline. It diminishes her uniqueness, which is the shape of her soul that she wants to be acknowledged. It's the most fundamental thing about being listened to, is people calling you by your name. I invoke Ladybird later on in these notes, and I think there's something similar there where both of them are possessive of a name because the name showcases who they are. And there's this reoccurring thing of not being understood and feeling personally neglected for that. Coraline exaggerates the danger she was in to get Mel to care. She's like, oh, I almost fell in the well. And Mel is like, that's nice. Mel still focuses on her work. Coraline wants to be heard. Mel is under immense pressure. So is her dad. These are the strains and compromises of adult life. Coraline is full of hope for adventure and good things, while her parents work hard to avoid the bad, which is getting evicted from the apartment that they just got into. Mel is stressed enough that she hit a truck and is now in a neck brace. When she talks about why she's not gardening, she motions to that and talks about the accident. She seems chronically unhappy. I almost never see her smile across the entire movie. Outside of work, though, it seems Mel never allows herself to truly relax. Miss Lovat may have been hiding the doll on purpose before YB gave it to Coraline. Maybe she was hiding it in her trunk. The doll acts as the other mother's spy. How much are the other mother's creations willing participants? And I get into this later. So I'll just leave it. Let's leave that question open. Would it have been too hard? Because, hold on. So you would think the fact that the other mother made this thing would mean that the thing is fully subservient to her. But that's not really true. And I talk about that a bit later on. Would it have been too horrifying for other father and other YB to be completely sociopathic towards Coraline? And this is me sort of dipping into it early. The movie, I think, pulls some punches. I think that there are ways in which the predatory nature of what the other mother is softened. And I think that that's a big reason why I said, oh, this video is 18 plus, because to get into that is to get into, I think, the horror of Coraline that Coraline hints at without going full into the depth of a predator like the other mother. There are ways the movie pulls the punches on the depths of evil. I will hopefully get into that later. Charlie is the lighter and more positive of the two. Jokes, smiles, defers to the boss. I think that, maybe there could be some sort of relationship dynamic where Mel was drawn to Charlie because of Charlie's positivity, that Charlie could make her laugh or have some positivity. And that, maybe Charlie likes having the boss to keep his life in order because he's not naturally ordered. I want to say that too. I don't think I'm going to talk about the typological arguments in the personality database. Before, I would have pulled up like every category and been like, well, they debated this character is this stuff. I'm going to talk about the characters for what they are. And maybe later I would come back and be like, oh, this typological perspective is interesting. When I talk about a piece of media, I think I'm just going to talk about it. But on the personality database, people were debating um, Charlie for like INTP and ISFJ. And I think that they're kind of missing the mark. I think that neither really sufficiently describes Charlie. If I had to give Charlie an MBTI type, I'd probably call him ENTP because I think that like from the INTP perspective, Charlie has a lot of FE. Like Charlie is, a casual, fun family man. In terms of like being in touch with his emotions, I think that Mel is a lot more out of touch than Charlie. And if you're gonna say like, oh, I think it's like this thing. If you're gonna call him an INTP, you're gonna be like, but he has developed FE. And if you call him an ISFJ, you're gonna be like, but he has developed NE. Like you take the weak spot of the type and just be like, well, it's developed actually. And so you're not addressing sort of the fundamental thing that I think defines a four-letter type is being so much in the dominant that you neglect the inferior. Um, and with Charlie, I think what he neglects is order and routine. Like he is fully reliant on Mel to create order and structure in his life, and I think if he didn't have that, he would sort of fall apart. Um, and so that I think that's what I would give him. And it also gives him the fact that he's logical and pragmatic and socially polite. Some tertiary FE. That's what I would give him. I don't know. I don't know. But I'm not running to give Charlie a four-letter type because I think that I don't look at Charlie and think of a four-letter type. I think of a goofy dad. Like I think he's just a goofy dad, and I think that goofy dad is not a thing that you can lasso neatly in any particular bundle of personality types. The apartments are neglected, like everyone there, which lines them up to get taken advantage of by the other mother. The door to the other mother's world is child-sized, probably on purpose. It's interesting how the Beldam preys on children. Metatextually, it speaks to Neil Gaiman's kids' love of witches as fake mothers. I watched a little bit about Neil Gaiman creating Coraline, and he talked about, wanting to create it for his kid, who was always talking about, like, oh, my fake mother is actually a witch, and all this stuff. And so they wanted a story like that, didn't find a good one, and then were like, I'm going to write her one. And so that motivation metatextually comes from that. But there's also a history to this. I think of Hansel and Gretel. I think the horror is the dependence of children, harder for them to break out of abusive captivity. The adult version might be Stephen King's Misery, taking advantage of physical injury, or Killing Stalking, taking advantage of size and strength difference. The dissonance in Coraline is what's real, which is like the awful casserole that Charlie gives Coraline, versus what's ideal, which is like the gigantic feast that they end up making, that the other mother makes. She follows a mouse to the door like Alice follows a rabbit to Wonderland. Everything is made happy in the other mother's world. The house of the other mother plays on mid-20th century American hospitality. It's like a commercial or department store display. Ideals. This is like the ideal family life, with the dad in the robe, and the mom and these casual clothes. It's warm, it's friendly, it's inviting, it's clean, it's manufactured, manicured. Ideal. It's ideal. And all of the stuff in the other mother world is ideal. And I talk about why later. The other father piano scene is very interesting. Based on the later finale, he doesn't want to hurt Coraline, even giving her the eye that creates his own death. He gives her the eye, and then he slips down under the lake, but then immediately freezes and basically dies. Um, so he did that because he liked Coraline and he was kind. The piano controls him, playing for him and later quieting him during the beginning of the mask off for the world. Why does the other father and other Wybie have will and agency outside of being the other mother's creation? So I thought about that for a good bit after writing that card, and then I said, logically, we can say that the other mother doesn't have complete control over her creatures. Obviously, because if she did, the other father and the other Wybie would not be doing this. The other mother's goal is to build dependence by being the one to satisfy Coraline's needs. Everything is ideal in this world because she wants to create this relationship with Coraline where everything that could ever go wrong in Coraline's life is something that the other mother could fix, would fix, will fix. All she needs is to be compliant to what the other mother wants, and the other mother just wants one small thing: to sew buttons into her eyes. Which is the deal with the devil that takes away her soul. And I wrote later in an index card, I want to say that, so the ghost children that come into the film later, there's this thing where, like, the ghost children are, what do I say? How do I say this? Where the ghost children are, why am I blanking? Oh, well, they had their eyes taken away. But then the film reveals that those aren't eyes. Like, there's one ball each, and then the balls are like, reminiscent of the objects that they were hidden as. It's like a circus ball and a gear shift thing and a ring, a pearl ring. Um, they also glow, which isn't like an eye. So when they talk about the eyes, I think about them as the souls of these children. They can't leave because their souls are trapped away. The eyes are the window to the soul. When the other mother takes away their eyes and replaces them with buttons, it's a way of making them purely instrumental and a way of taking away something fundamental. And that fundamental thing, I think, is their soul. So I wrote an index card later, like, hopefully I said this, and it was way later. So I just want to lay that out in terms of how I think about it. Because pretty much every time I talk about their eyes, I'm like eye/soul. And just to bring it up. Gotta go one back. So her goal is to build dependence because she wants compliance for Coraline to sell her soul, basically, to give away her eyes, to give away the fundamental aspect of herself, in order to get all the abundance that the other mother promises. And that's why the other mother creates and does all of this, is to create that dependence by fulfilling her every need to the ideal that she would even come up with that need so that she can get her to do that one small thing, which is very akin to the kinds of supernatural beings that promise you everything but then give you a bad deal. I don't know if I bring it up later, but, Dr. Facilier, I don't know if that's how you say his name, from Princess and the Frog, Facilier, I don't know. Rumpelstiltskin from Shrek Forever After, stuff like that. Characters like that, the archetype like that. This movie centers on emotional symbolism. I have to be careful not to read too far into certain elements, like the lightning strike being one of the Beldam's hands. It's like, oh, we could play a game in the rain. It's like, what rain? And then it's like, but the lightning is the Beldam's hand. And it's like, okay, but if the beldam is right in front of you, then how is that? But it's not like that. And this movie will do things that are seemingly impossible logistically, and the answer is like the emotionally fulfilling answer of magic. And if you read further into it, then it's a bit of a trap. Because you're not getting signal out of that, you're just getting noise. You're getting into the weeds of things. Coraline's stuffed animals showcase her love for nature. Now I said stuffed animals, but I'm talking about the stuffed animal, the squid. I'm talking about the snapping turtle. I'm talking about her dragonflies and stuff. Like I'm talking about those sorts of things that interact with her room, and I think that her teddy bear, right? I think that she has a love for animals, and I think that is a part of 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 her experience of stuff. So one of the punches the movie pulls, I think, is with the binary way it handles the feelings of predation from the beldam. As her manipulations are revealed, the mask falls off completely. Her true form is scary and authoritarian. She's not given a sympathetic motivation or any conflict with staying. What I mean by that is um, there's three stages to the beldam basically. There's the fact that she looks like her other mother, so she looks like Mel, but nicer, more polite, more a bit more theatrical, more uh 1950s housewife kind of look. And then her second phase is when she counts to three and she transforms into something much more beldam like, much more reminiscent of the sort of jagged angles and tall, intimidating, long sort of thing of a hag, basically, of some kind of witch that would do this kind of thing. And then the final phase of her design is after Coraline grabs the three eyes, and then goes into the room, and then her skin is now cracked, and her fingers are pure needles, and her appearance is much more deliberately spider-like and also decaying. And this is a very like monstrous look, and I emphasize, when I'm talking about the finale, this sort of monstrous nature. And the problem is that real predators are not so clean. Real predators, one, have a more sympathetic motivation on some level of like, oh, I genuinely want love or something. Like if you dig into a predator, it is rarely so instrumental and brutal and monstrous as the way that Coraline represents the other mother. And the other thing is that they attempt to put more hooks and manipulations into their victim in a way that makes it more difficult to emotionally disentangle. If a predator looked like a straight monster to a victim, then the victim is more inclined to leave, and which is exactly what the predator doesn't want. So with the other mother, she traps Coraline like physically, and plays these games with her. Um, well, I shouldn't say that because she only plays a game because Coraline offers a game. She traps Coraline and makes no effort to make herself more sympathetic, no effort to manipulate Coraline other than to tease her and to hurt her. Um, we'll mention a thing about the neglect that she creates later by getting rid of her parents and stuff, but she never takes advantage of it. And I think that is a way of the movie itself pulling the punch in order to make the movie more palatable and accessible, especially for children. Because there are a lot of turns that the movie could have made to be more darker and more realistic to the nature of predation that it doesn't take in order to make it a more reasonable fairy tale for kids to walk away with, oh, this is a type of predator. This is a type of monster. Now that I know, that's a good thing. So, the goal of a predator is to hook into the feelings of their victim to produce a gambling response from positive and negative feedback, creating dependence. So, there's this thing of like gaslighting, where it's like you're positive one day and then you're punishing the next. And what that does is it creates a gambling dynamic where you don't know what to expect. And so, um, in a victim of that kind of psychological abuse, it creates this dynamic of going back again and again to a predator, to an abuser. And the other mother doesn't do that at all, which she doesn't do that because this is a kids movie, and it's not showcasing all of that. But I emphasize these differences to, whenever I'm looking into a piece of media, I'm trying to think of what the thing symbolizes. And the other mother symbolizes a type of predatory person that is not good for other people. And it symbolizes this in a very monstrous way that actually, ironically, because of how monstrous it is, takes away the more like horrifying hooks of their behavior, and then leaves a less accurate impression of what that is in its lived form and execution. So I want to highlight those discrepancies because the accuracy of that is important. So the other mother does not do this, um, to make leaving much easier, like metatextually speaking. Additionally, she completely neglects her victims, leaving all three children behind the mirror. There is no calculus of pros and cons. Button eyes leads to a seeming fate worse than death, making separation easier. You know, say that Coraline was going to go back to parents that were persistently neglectful, which is abusive in its own way. Not to say that Coraline's parents are abusive, because they're not. They genuinely care. Um, but that, Coraline is struggling with something real. To say that she doesn't feel completely understood, doesn't feel cared for, that's a real thing and a valid thing. And to the degree that someone who is not good for you can fulfill those things and make you feel better, there's a pro and con to the relationship that is weighed when someone immerses themselves into an abusive or toxic dynamic. And with Coraline, and particularly with the other mother, the kids that she's done this to in the past are completely neglected, like like more neglected than you can ever imagine. They have been so wasted away that only their ghosts are left. They are secluded not even in the world, but behind a mirror, which is a thing that only reflects what is outside of it. There's hardly a more permanent prison than the inside of by the back, the impossible to view back of a mirror. And even in that, they are isolated in a completely cold, dark, damp room, huddled under a single blanket. Like, it is the epitome of neglect. And it's a neglect that basically says, the other mother is basically saying to the ghost children, like, I am done with you. And the only thing that she's taken from the ghost children, in terms of like repeated use, is their souls, is their eyes, which she then uses the life force from to perpetrate future lurings of other children. Um, this is not in any way attachment, and it's definitely not any kind of pros and cons that would lure someone into an abusive relationship. This is about as monstrous as it gets, and it seals the deal of like, this will not end well. Like, Coraline already rejected the button eyes even before she saw the conclusion of what they led to, but the barest amount of resistance to the actual plan causes the other mother to freak out and throw her into this mirror that shows the exact shape of her neglect. And I think the other mother is manipulative perfectly to the point of the reveal, and then it's not a single moment of mask off or some kind of gambling dynamic where sometimes she's caring and then sometimes she's extra cruel. It's just completely mask off, no care, to emphasize the fake nature of the original care and to emphasize that a predator like that can exist. But that is inaccurate to the way a real predator would navigate a dynamic like Coraline's. I don't know if I say it here, but also to sort of jump in advance, um, I think it's very easy to compare the other mother to the consuming mother archetype. But I think the consuming mother archetype relies on obsession and a sort of like vested interest in the childlike nature of the victim of the consuming mother dynamic. There's obsession, there is, a deep personal emotional investment into the state of the kid being young and being theirs, being their possession. The other mother has none of that. Because if the other mother had any of that, then the state of the ghost children would not be the complete and utter neglect, that they are currently in. So I think it's important to recognize that and divide the two because um, the other mother is a mother. The other mother plays on dependence. The other mother is doing something that is fundamentally toxic and abusive. And those are in common with the consuming mother archetype. But one of the key aspects of the consuming mother archetype is this obsessive care and this emotional value. And the other mother, in contrast, is purely an instrumental predator. So, and how bad that is makes separation easier, which is unlike how a real predator would navigate that. So, that should be about 45 minutes. I should probably split this into a second part, maybe more. So I will see you in the next part.